Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael McCarthy, the instructor for Harvard Extension Entrepreneurship and Innovation E5420. And I'd like to welcome my guest today, Andrew Soren, who is the founder of Eudaimonic by Design. Andrew, welcome.
Hello, Michael.
So Andrew's actually my advisor as I'm embarking on a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania for positive psychology. And it appears that Andrew's a good match to be my advisor because when I came to Penn, I had the question of how can we increase performance at corporations? Because they seem to have turned over every stone. And Andrew had the same question, but I like the answer that he found at Penn because he's already graduated. And I'm wondering, Andrew, can you just share with us that question and the answer that you found while studying at Penn and running your company?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm sorry I can't be with you live, but this feels like a good alternative. Yeah, so I went through the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at Penn in 2012, and when I did, I was working for a company in Canada called the Bank of Montreal, BMO Financial Group. It's one of the top 10 big banks in North America, and I had accountability at the time for really a big swath of leadership development within our retail bank. And the question that BMO was asking basically the entire time that I had been working there, which at that point had been about a decade, was really how do we get high performance? Everything that the company was focused on in so many ways from a cultural perspective was around trying to figure out the ways in which they could create competitive advantage, especially in the banking sector, where just about any bank is going to be the same. The biggest thing that they could land on as a differentiating factor was that their people were different, their commitment, their engagement, their innovation, their effectiveness. So they were constantly asking this question of what does it take to create high performance? And I had a big accountability to try to help answer that question, especially from a leadership development perspective. And of course, at that period of time, the ways in which we tried to answer the question of what high performance was generally came down to coaching in lots of ways, and to trying to encourage people to do the things that we might want them to do. In that case, maybe sell more Mastercards. And the way that they were thinking about coaching was in some ways all about consequence management. That the secret to high performance was just trying to measure out the consequences, the positive reinforcement you would give to people, the negative reinforcement to people when they got it wrong. And that felt really incomplete to me. Like, yes, for sure, you could get a certain degree of performance that way, but you weren't going to get high performance by just doling out consequences. There needed to be something else. And so I went on the hunt to try to figure out what that answer could be. And I had a hunch based on everything that I had done in my life beforehand. And I had originally started in theater and then went into philanthropy and cause marketing and eventually coaching. And to me, there was always something about being able to tap into what is most important to people, and ultimately being able to tap into this notion of meaning that we all had that seemed really important. And I had a sense that that was probably the answer to what high performance was. And it turned out that there was this whole entire field called positive psychology that was trying to study this. And so positive psych, if you haven't heard of it before, it's a field that was kind of coined around the turn of the 21st century by most predominantly a guy named Martin Seligman, who at the time was the president of the American Psychological Association. And he had this interesting observation about the field of psychology in general. And he basically said that, look, psychology was supposed to study the full spectrum of human experience, from people who are languishing at let's say a -10, to people who are just getting by at a 0, and to people who are thriving at the positive end of the spectrum. And you could plot that on a distribution curve where chances are there's probably a smaller number of people who are languishing in the world in just a general population. Most of the population is just getting by. And then some of the population is really thriving. And psychology as a discipline, from its being founded in the 19th century, really was supposed to look at all of that. But over the course of the 20th century, for a whole lot of really good reasons, it wound up focusing almost exclusively on languishing. I mean, even when you think about psychologists, you think about somebody who's trying to solve problems, who's trying to figure out like what's wrong with people. When you think about the biggest texts in psychology, it's the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, which basically is like the catalog of everything that could possibly be wrong with you. And Seligman was basically asking, well, okay, if that's where psychology has focused, what about the rest of it? And when he looked at the literature, there was some amount of literature on what it took to get by, and a very tiny amount of literature on thriving. And his concept was basically, look, all of it is important, but we focused so much on the negative that we have to do a correction to try to figure out and focus a little bit on the positive. And so he coined this term, positive psychology, which was supposed to be an umbrella for everything that kind of goes from the getting by, from the 0 to the +10. And that's what positive psychology really attempts to answer the question of. And for me, like, again, going back to my days at BMO, and going through that positive psychology program at Penn, the huge aha that I had was that high performance wasn't about consequence management. High performance was really about what it takes to get people to flourish. Now, to be able to like answer that, I had to do a history lesson in, actually a philosophy lesson in ancient history. So most of positive psychology is actually based on this fancy term, eudaimonia, which is an ancient Greek term that Aristotle would have used to describe basically the meaning of life. And he would have said that a person who was truly living a good life, if they look back at the end of their life and said, man, that was a life worth living, they were probably being driven by a purpose that was greater than themselves. And they were probably working every day to potentiate their best selves, to really bring their full set of strengths, their full character to that hard task of trying to do the right thing. There's actually a bunch of amazing psychologists who did this study at the beginning of the 21st century. Csikszentmihalyi, Howard Gardner, and William Damon. And they have this incredible project called the Good Work Project that really validates in so many ways what Aristotle was talking about 2,500 years ago, around the fact that if you really want people to feel like they're doing good work, it is this purpose-driven, greater than self, and working to your greatest potential and trying to do the right thing. That it's really this intersection between engagement, like bringing your full self to the table, excellence, trying to really pursue something fantastic, and ethics, trying to do the right thing. And in the middle of that Venn diagram is what eudaimonia is. And it's really the answer to what it means to be flourishing. And after literally thousands of years later, scientists tend to agree. If you look since Seligman founded positive psychology over the last 20 years or so to what has been studied, it turns out that these things are actually core to what it means for us to flourish, that all of this sense of eudaimonia is actually broken down into some pretty consistent pillars. And I'll just really quickly go through them. And he uses the term PERMA, but I'm gonna start with the A, especially since you guys are at Harvard. It's an achievement-oriented school. I'll just go there really quickly. That the reality is that people with the highest level of flourishing, the people who are really experiencing a great deal of eudaimonic well-being, are driven to make a dent in the world. They want to accomplish something important in their lives, but it's hard. So they need to actually have a whole bunch of psychological fitness, or what some researchers at the University of Nebraska, Fred Luthens and Yusuf and Avolio, Caroline Yusuf and Bruce Avolio, have termed psychological capital. That basically says when we are as psychologically fit as we possibly can be, we have hope, We have efficacy, or the confidence that we can do something. We have resilience to be able to overcome obstacles that get in our way. And we have optimism about the future. And these things ultimately allow us, they're developable, they're learnable, they're things that we can increase, and they're things that give us a tremendous leg up when it comes to achievement. However, it's not just that. It's not just our capacity to achieve. What Seligman and many others have found, especially a researcher whose name is Barbara Fredrickson, has found that the most flourishing amongst us also do so with a kind of positivity. You heard me mention a moment ago optimism and hope, but those who are truly flourishing are able to experience positive emotions of all kinds, like gratitude and joy and awe, love. And it's really important to think about why that is. When we experience something extraordinarily beautiful or moving, something that really kind of fills us, we feel excited. And that excitement has all sorts of physiological responses. It literally changes the way that our brains work. It changes our parasympathetic nervous system. Barb Fredrickson describes it as positivity resonance sprinkling around in our head. And when we do, it makes us feel really good. And that feeling really good winds up becoming a reinforcing mechanism that makes us want to do it all over again. And it's extremely, extremely important to our capacity to ultimately broaden our all of our resources and build our capacity to be able to do almost anything that we want to. Engagement. The people who, again, are most flourishing are people who lose themselves in a sense of flow. They understand their strengths and they know how to use them. A guy named Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow as this intersection between challenge and skill. Right? If we have too much challenge in any particular context and not enough skill, we might have anxiety. If we have too little challenge and a lot of skill, we might be kind of bored. But that sweet spot of really being able to say what's the right amount of challenge and what's the right amount of skill to really keep us engaged at any moment. And the most engaged and flourishing amongst us have figured out that formula. The other thing about people who are flourishing is that they build amazing relationships, and they build relationships because they know that doing the right thing, going back to that definition of eudaimonia, it's hard work and it's draining. And at the end of the day, doing so, it's not a solo activity. It's a team sport. So those who have built really great relationships, the science says this. Science is by a woman at University of Michigan called Jane Dutton, and Jane has been studying what makes relationships truly high quality. And she says that it's these kinds of behaviors that you see up here: our capacity to help people, task enable, our capacity to really listen to people and respectfully engage in conversation, our capacities to have really high trust with people and be vulnerable. And frankly, our capacity to play with people is probably one of the most important aspects of being able to have high quality connections. And this is the last one of the bunch: meaning. People who are flourishing ultimately see meaning all around them. They feel that they are part of something that's bigger than themselves, right? They have this kind of quality of transcendence that becomes so important to how they see themselves fitting into the world. And that gives them often a real sense of purpose, that they see themselves in service some way. And that sense of purpose really drives everything that they do. And it also allows them to feel a sense of belonging in the world. And ultimately, those things shape the stories that we tell. Emily Asfahani Smith, who wrote this incredible book, she's also a fellow mapster from UPenn. She graduated several years ago as well. She wrote this incredible book about meaning that talks about these 4 pillars and all of the research that grounds them. Anyway, that's PERMA, that's eudaimonia. There's one thing I want you to take away from everything that I've talked about, is that in so many ways, from an organizational perspective, and this is not only what I learned when I was in Penn, but what I've learned in the 8 years since, that if you want high performance, it's these things, it's those eudaimonic pillars of well-being that are the things that are going to give it to you. Those are the key to high performance. And frankly, in an organization, the reality is that that's probably the best and biggest design challenge we can have around how can we help or hinder eudaimonia in the organizations that we're part of. And at least in my work and in my practice now, what that looks like is trying to change systems, really thinking about all of the ways in which we construct systems in organizations, whether they're, for example, HR and the ways that we hire people or promote people or fire people, whether it's the ways that we make decisions from a financial perspective, whether it is ultimately the ways we think about governance, and the accountability that we have from a regulatory perspective. Do those things help or hinder us being eudaimonic for all of our stakeholders? And then the reality is that that's not just a thing that happens. That's something that actually requires a great deal of leadership. So what are the kinds of skills and practices and habits that leaders need to have to build the kind of PERMA that I've just described in this little talk? And then ultimately, how do you create a culture where all of this is co-created by the people who need to live it, and then there's all of the sum of beliefs and behaviors that ultimately create the conditions where we can be our most eudaimonic selves. At least to me, that's what I think is the thing that's most important for us to focus on. So let me pause there. That's a lot. Michael, maybe you can ask me questions.
Yeah, Andrew, this is great. And it's funny, we seem to be, one, disclosure alert, I think Andrew and I are both drinking the same Kool-Aid of positive psychology. But the way I looked at it, we seem to be on the same path. And I do have a question for you is, I really want to make sure that my life is meaningful and well led.
Mm,
A few basic statistics that I've always had in my head was, well, you spend about a third of life sleeping, a third working, and then a third doing whatever else, fun, let's say. But when you take out the sleep, the statistic gets even stronger. Now it's half work and half whatever else. And that's a big 50%. Um, I really want to make sure that I like where I'm working. And at the same time, you see these corporations that are trying to, squeeze a dime out of a nickel. And I get that. And I had this idea of, well, if you could make people really, really love what they're doing during that half of their waking life, who's the beneficiary of that would be the employer, because people are going to be doing their all. And I had the concept of, if you could apply the concepts of well-being to a human being and transpose that onto a corporation as if it was a person, could you just put them on? And I'm curious, you're in consulting, you have shown this to other people where it's a new concept. What do they think of this? How do they receive this message?
yeah, I think it's well, I think there's two parts of your question. One, this individual as organization or organization as individual. And I think that you're right in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think that we can think of an organization to a certain extent as an individual, but we also have to recognize that an organization is nothing but all of the individuals that make it up. And ultimately, if those individuals aren't flourishing or eudaimonic or happy or whatever language you particularly want to give it, they're not going to be productive. They're not going to be engaged. They're not going to be showing up. They're not going to be giving it their all in the way that we need to be able to have thriving organizations. And so I think that at a huge level, this stuff is so important to an organization. And in my experience, in terms of, to answer the second part of your question around like how are people receiving it, in my experience, I think that there's probably a distribution curve of people and how they receive this. Everything, we're psychologists, everything winds up on a distribution curve. There's a bell curve of everything. I think that there are some, and these are certainly the ones that I like to work with, who are evolved, and they've already decided that HR is gone with, and they have people and culture, organizations, and they know that their people are a competitive advantage, and they want to be people first, all of that kind of language. And they look at all of this, and they're like, yes, like finally we have science to back up the assumptions that we've always had. And I believe that there's always been leaders like that. And then I think that on the other end of the spectrum, you do have the opposite. You have, very command and control style organizations that really just do believe that the answer is greater productivity at all costs. And that's an economic balance sheet that you are constantly trying to work through. And at the end of the day, people aren't important at all. And it's just about efficiency. And I think there's definitely a portion of the world that's like that I think, quite frankly, is getting smaller over time. But I think that the reality is you have a whole lot of people in the middle. And those people kind of go back and forth. I mean, I think that there's some signs of tremendous progress. So for example, I look at the work that the Business Roundtable did in 2019. Business Net Roundtable being this giant conglomerate of 185 of the biggest brands and corporations in the world coming together to say, hey, look, we need to change what the purpose of business is. And the purpose of business is no longer just to maximize shareholder investment, but the purpose of business really is to satisfy the needs of all of our stakeholders. And as soon as you're starting to think about stakeholder engagement, I think you have to start thinking about all the things that I just described. You have to be seeing your role as a corporation as trying to do something worth doing. And I think that that pressure is ultimately, spelling good things for people like us who want to see more of this work in the world.
I'm glad that when I heard Jamie Dimon say that we've gone from shareholder value to stakeholders, that was when I thought, yeah, the employees are stakeholders, the customers are stakeholders, the suppliers, the farmers who are breathing the air from the factory that is making whatever product, they're stakeholders. So we're all part of this. And I think it all needs to be good and be aware of the impact that we're having to everybody. So I was really thrilled when he came out and said that, because people listen to Jamie Dimon and he's
Yeah.
back.
And I think that, take it, that was all pre-COVID. Look at COVID now. And I think that what most organizations have found is that if we don't take care of our people, if we don't actually think about the well-being of our people, we have nothing, right? Like, to me, if there's one giant lesson that the pandemic has taught us, it's that. And perhaps one of the most awe-inspiring things about the pandemic, awe in the true shock and awe, but also positive kind of way, is that it forced most companies around the world to prioritize their people over profit, at least for a few months. And I think that also moves us into the direction of trying to really understand everything I just described.
Yeah, and so my final question for you, our students at this stage of the semester in our entrepreneurship class, their one project is to create a company. That's basically what they're doing in this class. So they're embarking on, what problem am I solving? I'm building a team. Who are my customers? With what you know about this space, what advice could you give them, or encouragement on how they could incorporate this as they're just creating the beginnings of a business? What sort of things would you like to share with them that you think could make anyone's project idea do better based on what you know?
Yeah, I would go back to that definition of eudaimonia that I started with. This notion of when we do something of purpose that's ultimately bigger than ourselves, and we bring our full capacity and strengths to be able to achieve that, that's when we actually have something special. And as an entrepreneur, I think frankly, most entrepreneurs are quite eudaimonic. I mean, most people who are trying to start a business have a lot of that at the very core of what they do. It's actually when they scale businesses that we tend to lose it. But I think that your surest route to success and surest route to team building is to start with that why, to start with that purpose. What is it that you're ultimately doing, and how does that purpose ultimately make a difference and make a dent in the world? I do think that's critical, no matter what it is that you're doing, because it's ultimately the magnetic thing that's going to help everything moving forward. And then I think part B of that is to try to figure out, within the teams that you're pulling together, how can you be more than the sum of your parts? How can you constantly be looking at constellations of strengths and thinking, how can I potentiate these strengths? How can I constantly be thinking, of taking the very best of the people that I'm working with and applying it to that really important task. And that's not, it's not just something you do at the beginning. It's not like a speech that you make, but it's a daily practice. I mean, it's like yoga. It's like, that's what you're doing. That's what going to work is. And it's something you do every day. And some days it will be easy and some days it will be really hard, but that if you get really good at doing that practice, I don't think that there's a higher recipe for high performance you'll find.
Beautiful. Andrew, thank you so much. I think you've inspired our students because they're looking for all the motivation they can get. Thank you so much for the time and your insights today. And when we have our final night, we'll be sending you an invitation if you'd like to come look at all the final pitches. It's a fun night. You'll have to pop your own popcorn, but it's a good time.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Thanks so much. And if anybody has any questions, Michael knows how to get in touch with me.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye for now.